Right, and now let's start with the content, with the lectures. And the first one is by Martin Rentsch. He works in the Berlin office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and he will talk about the European refugee situation.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. As said, my name is Martin Rentsch. I'm Assistant External Relations Officer here at UNHCR's National Office in Berlin. So basically, I'm a press person, if you want. And today, I would like to give you an overview of the global displacement crisis, of its magnitude, of the current challenges we are facing as an organization, as the mandated UN organization. And I would like to also include the European refugee situation. But first and foremost, put this into comparison to the forgotten crises that you find all over the world, forgotten refugee crises. So first of all, I don't know how many of you know UNHCR, know what we're doing. UNHCR, this cryptic acronym, it stands for United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It's actually a person. His name is Filippo Grandi, an Italian. And it's also an agency, a UN agency mandated to lead and coordinate international action to protect refugees, people displaced, to resolve refugee problems worldwide. We are a non-partisan, unpolitical humanitarian organization, and our protection mandate is derived from the Geneva Refugee Convention founded in 1951. So our organization has a quite long history. And to give you an idea of what we're doing, where we come from, what our mandate is, what our tasks are in the current situation, I would like to start by showing a short video just to give you an idea.
The faces tell our story. The displaced, the disowned, the deprived. They are who we are, who we help. Lives uprooted, torn apart by wars, conflicts, persecution, natural disasters. All of them people of concern for the United Nations Refugee Agency. The Second World War left nations torn apart and refugees fleeing their homelands. More than 1 million of them. Governments needed help. The crisis needed coordination. In December 1950, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was established. In July 1951, the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees was adopted. A refugee is someone outside his or her own country and unable to return as a result of a well-founded fear of persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a social group. Its founders thought UNHCR's task would take just 3 years. They were wrong. In 1956, Hungarians rose up against Soviet occupation and were crushed. 200,000 people fled their country. It was UNHCR's first emergency. The 1960s saw decolonization in Africa and wars. Independence wars, civil wars, border wars. Hundreds of thousands were forced to flee. Refugees were no longer just a post-World War European issue. They could be found across the world. And so the legal foundation guiding UNHCR's work was changed in the 1967 protocol. It would have global responsibility for refugees. In the 1970s, the spotlight of conflict shone on Latin America and Asia. In the 1980s and 1990s, new wars erupted in Africa, the Middle East, Southern Europe. the numbers of those in need spiraled upward in Lebanon, Somalia, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Uganda. In 1951, UNHCR started with 34 employees. By the end of 2014, it had over 9,330 working in 125 countries, and 146 countries had signed the Convention on Refugees. Its work recognized with Nobel Peace Prizes in 1954 and 1981. At the end of the 20th century, in a world of civil wars, ethnic conflict, natural disasters, there were new victims. Driven from their homes but not their countries. UN guiding principles identified a new group of people in need, the internally displaced. Internally displaced persons are persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. As conflicts have altered, so has the role of UNHCR. In the Balkans, UNHCR moved to work directly in the conflict zones, something it had not done in its first 4 decades. It continues to do so to this day. In the new century, the world now has the highest number of refugees and internally displaced since World War II. Nearly 60 million. There are long, bitter wars in Somalia and Afghanistan, strife in Central African Republic, Nigeria, South Sudan, Yemen, Libya, and in Syria, a country fractured. 4 million refugees have fled to nearby countries. Over 7 million are internally displaced. And at sea, thousands of lives lost. Syrians, Somalis, Eritreans, Ethiopians, all in search of a safer life. The challenges grow alarmingly. UNHCR, over 60 years after its birth, will face them all, innovating and adapting and counting on a protection mandate that is one of the strongest in international law. Partnerships with over 900 other agencies and strong support from donors, governments, and people like you.
Okay. So far, you could see we have a long-standing history of protecting internally displaced and refugee and stateless people. The cornerstone of our work is still the Geneva Refugee Convention, adopted in 1951, and its direct reaction to what happened in the Second World War. And it's still relevant, just because it's not only an international document, it's not only a document in international law, it's been transferred to European law. It's in the German asylum law. So you will find elements of the Geneva Refugee Convention in mostly all law sets of the signatory states of the Geneva Refugee Convention, and that is why it's still relevant. I'd like to go one step back and ask you, why do refugees actually need protection? Of course, it's somewhere in international law. It's written in the Geneva Refugee Convention. But the answer is quite simple, and it makes clear why the Geneva Refugee Convention is still relevant, because it's a genuine task of a state to protect its citizens. And for example, if you look at the people fleeing from Syria, they are no longer protected by their government. Actually, the Syrian government is in many cases the entity persecuting those people. And those people arrive, for example, in Lebanon, 1 million people, in Jordan, 650,000 people, or in Turkey, 2.7 million Syrians. And they arrive in those states, and they are no citizens of those countries. And this is why they are not protected, because the host countries, they are not responsible for those people. And that is why there's something needed, the international community who has to step in and who has to protect those citizens by making the countries worldwide sign the Geneva Refugee Convention. The majority of these world states, world countries has signed the Geneva Refugee Convention, which is a good thing because it's basically the Magna Carta of international refugee protection. What's in there? The definition of a refugee. Who is a refugee? What obligations has a refugee? What obligations does the admitting state have? What are assistance and social rights of a refugee? What are exclusion clauses under which someone cannot be recognized as a refugee? These are all things that are in the Geneva Refugee Convention, which makes it still relevant. And the cornerstone of the Geneva Refugee Convention is basically the non-refoulement principle, which means that a refugee should not be returned to a country where he or she faces serious threats to his or her life or freedom. And I don't want to bore you with long text, you've already seen it in the video, but I would like to draw your attention to the Article 1A of the Geneva Refugee Convention, because that's the actual definition in international law what a refugee actually is. We heard that we have 65 million refugees around the world, which is only partly true, because a refugee is actually someone who is, I won't read the whole thing, but I highlighted the important part. The most important part of the whole definition is the word persecuted, for different reasons: race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group. What could that be? Homosexual people, for example, or political opinion. And derived from the Geneva Refugee Convention, we have a mandate of international protection of refugees. What does that mean? That first and foremost means physical protection. So people arriving somewhere in the refugee camp, somewhere in the desert, they need physical protection. That's why we deliver humanitarian aid in form of tents, blankets, all those kind of stuff. But it also means legal protection, and that's what we do here in Germany. We do not erect tents in Germany. We provide legal protection, meaning that we monitor the quality of the asylum procedure, we comment on draft laws and all those kind of things. And we, as UNHCR globally, we strive for durable solutions. And the first best durable solution is voluntary return to the home countries. But the fact is, and the truth is, that last year only 200,000 people were able to return to their home countries due to the security situation and the many conflicts in our world. The second best solution is always integration, and that's what many of you do. Integration in the host countries, in the countries of first asylum. What does integration mean? It means social integration. It means access to the labor market. It means education for kids. So it's really practical. And the third best solution is resettlement. And this is only a partial solution for a few very vulnerable refugees. It's a program by UNHCR, and host countries, first and foremost the US, they provide on an annual basis 100,000 admission places for people from, for example, Lebanon or other countries where especially vulnerable people get a place in those programs and can start afresh or make a fresh start in a third country. And apart from this mandate, we deliver cash assistance, relief items that I just mentioned, and we cooperate with many partners around the world, because we are not the only agency working for refugees. We are the protection agency, but you have WFP, you have other UN organizations we collaborate with, and of course many, many hundreds of other NGO partners around the world. Here you can see a snapshot or figures at a glance. We have 65 million people displaced worldwide. 21 million of them are refugees and 10 million are stateless people. And if you look at the graphic in the middle, you can see that 50% of the world's refugees only come from 3 countries, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria. So if there was a political solution to those conflicts, many people would be able to return, and there would only be half of the world's refugees if those conflicts were resolved. We have almost 10,000 people working around the world. The majority of them, 86%, are working in the field, are working directly in the conflict zones, and we work in 126 countries. I would like to clarify something about this 65 million refugees figure. It's actually 65 million people of concern, 65 million people displaced, and as I said, 21 million of them are refugees. So what does it mean? People fleeing from war and persecution across an internationally recognized border. You've seen it in the video. And 5.2 of them are actually under the mandate of another UN organization, which is UNRWA, protecting Palestine refugees. And the biggest part, the majority of people on the move, people fleeing their homes, are actually within their home country. They are internally displaced people, so-called IDPs. And they had to leave their homes, but not their countries. So that is why transcontinental movements, or the situation that you've seen last year, people coming from Syria, Iraq to Europe, is actually still the exception. And you have 3.2 million asylum seekers, so people who mostly arrived in Western countries with a proper asylum procedure, and they are somewhere in the middle of their asylum procedure. That's why they are called asylum seekers. I think we can skip this. I already mentioned that we are doing legal protection here, lobby work, training of adjudicators, so the people at the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees who are actually deciding on asylum claims. We train them on the management level, and we're monitoring the quality of the asylum procedure and raising awareness. That's what we do right now. Where the refugees live, as you can see, you don't have to figure out what's in the map. I just want to draw your attention to the colored countries. Red are the countries producing refugees, and blue are the countries that host the majority of the world's refugees. And 2 things are striking. Host countries are most of the time adjacent to refugee-producing countries, which means that 86% of the world's refugees, they actually stay in the region where they come from, because they have the hope to return to their home country, because it's their cultural environment. The people there, they speak the language, and those people are not coming to Europe. And that's why, secondly, you see that Europe, despite of the fact that many people came, 1 million were registered in Italy and Greece last year, despite of the fact that 1 million people came, Europe, or the countries of Europe rather, they are not the main host countries for refugees worldwide. And I know that in international media, being a press officer, you sometimes get a sense that Germany or other countries in Europe are overrun by refugees, but this is not backed up by global data. Secondly, another myth is that all of the world's refugees live in camps. Actually, only 10% of, let's say, the Syrian refugees are actually living in camps like this. This is Zaatari, somewhere in the Jordanian desert. It's the biggest refugee camp for Syrians. And it looks a bit chaotic, but actually there's the street you see in the middle is called Champs-Élysées. And there are 3,000 shops there. You have a shop for, for example, pizza delivery service with 80,000 potential customers. You can rent wedding dresses. You can buy basically anything. So it's a desperate situation, that's for sure. But the people trying to make the best out of it, and there's entrepreneurship, and they try to make the best out of this desperate situation. And what we do as a UN, we usually, we are basically mandated to lead the protection cluster in those camps, and we work together with other agencies. You can see there are sports grounds, there there are schools, there are community centers, and we try to identify community leaders to work with them and to have the people there living in a dignified way. But the truth is that many of the Syrian refugees in the region, and that's where most of them live, they live in such conditions. That's a photo from northern Iraq, from the Houk region. And it's an abandoned building, and Syrian refugees moved in and somehow built a makeshift shelter. And that's the reality for many Syrians in the region. And they live in mosques, they live with friends and family, they live in apartments sometimes, and in abandoned houses, in gyms, and most of them actually do not live in refugee camps. A few words about our current emergencies, because time is running out. You can see Syria is still the biggest crisis of our generation, and the biggest crisis that we as UNHCR have been confronted with in our 65-year-old history. 4.8 million refugees left their country, went to another place, went to most of the time neighboring states, and went to then Europe. The Syria conflict spilled over to Iraq, where you have 4 million people displaced within Iraq, plus 250,000 Syrian refugees. At Europe's doorstep, you have still the looming conflict, or active conflict rather. In Ukraine, you have South Sudan, which is just an example for the many forgotten crises in Africa. You have Burundi, you have Mali, you have the DRC, you have the Central African Republic. So there are many crises in Africa, and South Sudan crisis just hit the 1 million refugees mark. As I said, the biggest conflict we're facing, and it's our biggest operation, our biggest humanitarian operation, is the Syria conflict. And as you can see, most of the Syrian refugees, they live in the region, most of them in Turkey, which is now the biggest host country for refugees worldwide. And it's still the case that many of those people coming to Europe, they flee directly from Syria. So they are not coming from the neighboring countries, they're coming directly from Syria. And one example of those neighboring states affected mostly by the Syrian refugee influx is Lebanon. Lebanon has 4.5 million inhabitants and 1 million Syrian refugees. So that means that basically in every settlement, in every village, you have Syrian refugees. Most of them are women and children, as you can see. And they are living, because the Lebanese authorities, they do not allow proper refugee camps. Most of those refugees, they live in makeshift shelters, they live in informal settlements, and they, most of the time, live under the poverty line, 52% in extreme poverty. Only 11% of the households are food secure, and many have residency problems. And that is not only something that UN organizations, humanitarian organizations have to deal with. If you look at the situation in Lebanon, where you have Syrian refugees in every village, it's a problem of the infrastructure. So getting the rubbish picked up by service providers, for example, it's a big challenge if the inhabitants of a certain village double within a few months. And this work cannot be done only by UN organizations and NGOs. It's a long-term problem, and it has to be invested in those host countries in a longer perspective to solve somehow the situation. Because this situation in those countries and in the crisis region, it affects Europe. Not to the extent that Europe is a big host continent, but still, those people from conflicts that were usually far away, that are now living among us. Because last year you see the gray the gray figure in the upper right corner, 1 million people were registered in Greece and Italy. And this is the numbers are from 2016. So you have so far 300,000 people registered in Greece or Italy. So the numbers are still high despite of the fact that they are declining. And Germany, Austria and Sweden are the main host countries in Europe. And those are the numbers for Germany. You can see in yellow, this is the pre-registration number for asylum claims. So basically people registered by the German authorities at the border, at reception centers. And the numbers are decreasing. You can see they are standing at the moment at 16,000 people per month. And the line in blue, those are asylum claims. So people who then have actually lodged a formal asylum claim. And the number has been, you can see the numbers are quite stable, because last year when many people came, where the spike is, you can see that many didn't have the chance to lodge a formal asylum claim, and now this backlog is worked off. What we are aiming at as an organization in this international or global crisis situation, we push countries to assume their responsibilities under the Geneva Refugee Convention, that they actually admit people to their territory, that they provide protection, that they provide integration and all those durable solutions. We try to assist, for example, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey and all the other countries in Africa who are either unwilling or unable to provide protection for refugees. And we try to reduce the pressure and support those countries. We are, and that's our main point in the current debate, we are striving for international solidarity, a global system of burden sharing in which all countries around the world take their part through, for example, resettlement, through humanitarian admission schemes, but also by binding financial commitments for the humanitarian aid and the work that many of the NGOs and international organizations, but also the host countries are doing. And we are driving advocacy for a relocation scheme in Europe, which is part of this burden sharing system, which is part of international solidarity, because if only Greece, Italy, Germany, Sweden and Austria take in refugees, this cannot be a sustainable admission system for a continent like Europe with the European values. And the big problem in this context is always financing. We depend on, and this is not only true for UNHCR, this is true for all UN organizations, but also for many NGOs. They depend on voluntary contributions from governments, intergovernmental institutions, individuals, private persons, private citizens, foundations and corporations. And we have a budget, so that's what we wish for, of 7.2 billion US dollars, which is quite a lot. But usually we only get half of this money. So that means that people of concern to UNHCR, refugees, internally displaced, they are directly affected. The question that arises then in the field is, do you, for example, vaccinate 300 children, or do you treat one person with cancer? And those are the critical questions that our colleagues in the field have to ask themselves if money is scarce. And the main problem is that those new crises in Iraq, Syria, and the many African situations, plus the protracted refugee situations, for example, in Somalia, Afghanistan, they bring the humanitarian financing system to its capacity limit. And that's something the international community has to work on. Thank you.